This episode of Uncorking a Story is brought to you by Mike Carlin's novel, The Ruin of Souls. Do you like books like The Da Vinci Code or Gone Girl? Then you're going to love The Ruin of Souls. You can find it at bookshop.org or wherever books are sold. Enjoy the show. Well, hello, and welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and today I have the one and only Aug Stone on the show to discuss the backstory behind his memoir, Nick Cave's Bar. And listen, don't feel bad if you have no idea who Nick Cave is, because to be honest, I wasn't cool enough to know about him either. But the important thing here is that Aug and his friend Andy knew who he was, and even more importantly, believed that he owned a bar in Berlin based on a rumor overheard in Spain. So 20 years ago, they had what can best be described as a misadventure in Europe, complete with very bad decisions, near misses at true love, and drinking. Lots and lots of drinking. Now, listen, you're going to hear that from Aug in a moment. And when you hear from Aug, you'll definitely hear a sense of familiarity between the two of us. I actually met Aug a couple of years ago when I started doing stand-up comedy. I started performing at open mics in the area and at the Stress Factory in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which is an awesome comedy club. I first ran into someone known as the Young Southpaw. And that is a character that he has created. And Young South, as our friend Alyssa Goji likes to call him, is one of the most interesting characters I've ever seen on stage. Aug puts in so many different pop cultural references into this character. What seems like is a stream of consciousness, but is actually well thought out and certainly very well articulated. It was, I have to say, it was great to catch up with him. I've really missed the comedy scene and doing stand-up comedy, and talking to Aug was just a really nice trip down memory lane. And you're going to hear about this misadventure in Berlin and other parts of Europe, most notably the Prague, in a few moments. And it really, though, his story got me to thinking about adventure. Or shall I say, like, the lack of adventure that's in my life. Now, I don't come from a very adventurous gene pool. You know, my father, loves to tell a story about how he graduated from Iona College on a Saturday, and that Monday he was in the service. There was no backpacking through Europe. There was no studying abroad, although, according to my mother, he did study a few broads. In his lifetime before meeting her anyway. The Swedish girls have been mentioned frequently. I'm not so sure about that. But I think it's really folklore, Carlin folklore. But I digress. After being discharged from the Coast Guard, he started working at American Express. He stayed there for about 45 years before retiring. Growing up when we vacationed, it was always to Florida. Why? Because our grandparents lived there. Did we fly? No, of course we didn't fly. We drove. We drove to Florida from Connecticut. And as painful as that was, some of our best memories of growing up are actually the result of the drive, not necessarily the destination. We didn't take big trips to the Caribbean. We didn't go any further west than Little Falls, New York, which is where my mother's aunt and uncle owned a farm. So it was really Connecticut, Florida. That's it. And just looking back in my own adult life, the majority of my travel has been business travel, and much of that are just quick in and outs to whatever markets I was hired to do research in. I would fly to LA on a Monday morning and fly back on a Tuesday morning. There's no sightseeing, no walk of fame, anything like that. And that's just the way I guess I'm wired. I've been to Sweden once. That was fun, and that was on a hockey trip for my daughter. But it wasn't exactly, a relaxing vacation for me. It was a lot of hockey rinks. A lot of hockey rinks in Sweden in February. I mean, it's cold. Come on. But it was fun. I met some great people there. But I do have to tell one story. So I'm going to uncork my own story here for a second. There was one time when I was in Paris. Now, I had gone to Paris. I was working for a startup. I was like employee number 3 at the startup. The guy who founded the company is a guy named Nick Nyan. Great guy, very smart. We're kind of polar opposites. He was Mr. kind of fly by the seat of your pants. You had to be, back in those days, making a internet startup. We were in Paris. We were attending a conference. Now, I don't think we had tickets to this conference. I don't even think we were exhibiting or sponsoring. We were there because we knew some important people were going to be there, and we were just going to hang out, at the hotel bar where the conference was, trying to meet people or whatever. We did get a dinner out of it, but we were there trying to drum up some business for this startup. And one day we decided to take the afternoon off, and Nick decides that would be a good idea to rent motor scooters. Now, I had my reservations about this idea. First of all, the weather was definitely looking iffy that day in Paris. Secondly, Parisian drivers, I mean, you've seen the movies, maybe. I don't know. Maybe you've been to Paris. They're not friendly. They're not forgiving. I could barely ride a bicycle, and here I am, getting on this device, which I've never been on a motor scooter up until that point in my life. And he told me, he's like, Mike, the reality is you just got to live a little bit. And if you know Nick Nyan, the reality is should be the name of his blog or podcast or something. Anyway, he told me to live a little. I lived a little, and we did Paris by motor scooter. I almost died 4 times. But hey, at least I was in the city of lights, right? And just like those trips down to Florida where we're driving, that was the most memorable part of the trip for me. It's one of the most memorable afternoons of my life. And I remember we stopped by Montmartre because I wanted to go into the Basilica of the Sacred Heart, or the Sacré-Cœur Basilica, because I'm a good Catholic boy. And of course, my French teacher, Mr. Boursier, from high school, used to talk about it all the time. Part of our French class was to study a map of Paris and, of course, note where all the notable houses of worship were. And I'm like, you know what? I want to go and I want to check it out. I want to see it with my own eyes. When am I ever going to be here again, Mr. Lack of Adventure? So I do a little tour of the church, check out the architecture. 10 minutes later, we're hungry. We're standing by a bread vendor. So we get a baguette and we proceed to go to town on it like we haven't eaten in months. And it was delicious and completely stereotypical. And that's when we saw them. A group of young American girls were lost. And we knew they were lost because they were holding a map and they were turning it as if it were like a steering wheel to try and make sense of where they were. Now, for context, we're talking 1999. No one's walking around with smartphones. We didn't have Google Maps in our pocket. You couldn't ask Siri to find the metro. They were nervous. They didn't know where they were. So they spotted us, the rebels that we were with our bad motor scooters. Thank you, Montrose. And thought we were locals. They thought we were locals. So the leader of that pack, comes up to us and does that thing where you speak really, really slowly when you're in a foreign country, right? You speak really slowly in your native tongue, thinking that the tempo is the problem, right? The tempo is the problem with a language barrier, not, understanding the words, the language, the syntax. It's the tempo. So she's like, "Excuse me, can you tell me where the metro is?" And she's doing it in a way where her lips are like, as if we could read lips in a foreign language, right? It's like, so now he and I just look at each other and laugh, right? And back then, I was funny, but I didn't really have the confidence. I think I was like 24, maybe 25 at this point. I didn't have the confidence to roll with things the way I now. Now, if this happened now, I would have had a little bit more fun with it. And I would have used my skills as an improviser, but I didn't have those back then. And man, I wish I could have strung them along a little bit and gotten some big laughs out of it. But, at the end of the day, we admitted that we were Americans, but we knew where the metro was. We gave them directions to the subway, and we never saw them again, which was fine because I was married and Nick was in a very serious relationship. But later that night, we wind up at the Guinness pub. Now, we're in a place called Paris, right? This is not an Irish city. We wind up in an Irish pub, which is fine. Nick and I both have a little Irish in us. And we had gotten caught in the rain, and we were just like done, and we needed some kind of alcohol relief. And we decided to try out our high school French. Both of us took French in high school to converse with the locals. And I'll tell you this: we met a guy who played in a band, and Nick is a great guitar player. I'm okay. I'm not stellar, but I can talk. I can certainly talk the talk when it comes to the guitar. And we talked to the guitarist in this band who basically mimed to us that music is its own language, and it's a language that comes from the heart, or la cour, as he kept saying, la cour. And Nick and I, we drove everyone back in the office nuts by imitating this one man that we met. Yeah, but it's true. Music does come from the heart. And speaking of things that come from the heart, this brings us right back to Aug Stone and his story about the misadventures he had with his late friend Andy trying to find Nick Cave's rumored bar. It's definitely a story that comes from the heart. And let me just give you a few tips. If you're considering absinthe as you listen to this interview, I'd say don't do it. It's never a good idea to mix copious amounts of absinthe with on top of other alcohol. If you have anything else in your system right now, put down the absinthe. Don't do the thing with the sugar and the heat. It's not going to end well. And to really understand why I'm saying this, you'll have to listen to my interview with Aug Stone. Enjoy. But I have to start with, because you are much more of a music guy than I am. I mean, you're a musician. In addition to being a writer, I didn't know who, and this is embarrassing. I didn't know who Nick Cave was until I heard your story. So why don't we start there? Who is Nick Cave, and why was his supposed bar so important to you?
Well, I'm glad to introduce you to Nick Cave, because I think he is one of the finest lyricists, and his songs. He's an Australian musician who's got to start in a band called the Boys Next Door, who morphed into the Birthday Party, and they were just wild. Like, they just didn't care. It was cowboy hats and leather, and there's one video where Nick's holding the microphone, a cigarette, and a shot of whiskey all in one hand and just screaming into it. And the bass player's got he's bent over backwards, got his head in the kick drum. Very abrasive music, very interesting. There wasn't a lot going on like that in the early 80s. And when I discovered Nick Cave, I was probably around 20, 21. And that type of aggression really appealed to me then. And then it's weird because Birthday Party broke up, but then he started a solo band, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, which had various members of the Birthday Party and the whole Australian scene. And they had relocated to London by that time, and Berlin. They were kind of half and half. And it's weird because the first early solo records are, again, pretty abrasive, not very melodic. And then around the late 80s, he just started writing these beautiful songs, really, heartfelt and moving piano ballads, which is a complete departure from, what he had been doing at the beginning of the decade. And then everybody kind of went with him. I always found it kind of weird that, there was these, hardcore punk rockers who also were very moved by songs like The Ship Song or Straight to You. And I mean, I'm a sucker for more of the, the melody stuff anyway. And I had one Nick Cave album, the one that came out 95, 96, The Good Son, which is incredible. It was all about his relationship with PJ Harvey and some just lovely songs on there. He uses lots of religious imagery in his lyrics. And I know a friend of mine, or a friend of a friend, actually had the opening song on that album played at their wedding.
Wow.
And then, so I had that one album. I liked it a lot. And I was a huge record collector. I hadn't explored more of his stuff yet, but my best friend, the guy who became my best friend, Andy, who I went on this trip with, he had just moved to Boston, was living with some very good friends of mine all in one house. And that's kind of how we met. And he and the guy he moved from Lowell to Boston with knew I was like a huge record collector. And they made a concerted effort to get me into Nick Cave because they knew I would then buy all the albums and they could hear them. So 1998, this plan went into effect. I bought my 1000th CD. I think it was March 17th or 18th. It was like around St. Patrick's Day. And I threw a big party at my friend's house. That was the party house. Like I was in an apartment with my sister, but that we would always hang out there. And I was like, bought a couple kegs. I went out and bought my 1000th CD that day. Friends of mine came up from Baltimore and from Connecticut, and we just had a great time. And then the next day I went out because my friends were up, from out of town. We went record shopping again, and I bought 12 more CDs. One of which was that first Nick Cave album, From Her to Eternity. And then I just kept buying more that year. And I finally saw him for the first time, like right after I graduated in September of that year at the Roxy in Boston. And I felt really out of place because there were like these really hardcore fans, about 3,000 capacity, I would say. And I had really just gotten into him, in the preceding months, but, there were people there who were very much looked the part. But it was one of the best shows. I remember, like, he just came out, he was supporting the Greatest Hits album. So the set list was literally the Greatest Hits. And then the next day I bought his biography, this biography someone wrote about him. And then I headed off to Europe, backpacking around with another good friend of mine from college. And it was at that point in Barcelona that a complete stranger told me that Nick Cave owned a bar in Berlin. And I knew it's weird because I had been reading the biography. I knew he spent time in Berlin. Didn't occur to me until like 20 years later that if he did in fact own a bar in Berlin, it might have been mentioned in that biography I was reading.
All right.
But no, I took this complete stranger's word for it that Nick Cave owned a bar in Berlin. I wasn't going to Germany on this trip, but as soon as I got back to Massachusetts, I told my best friend Andy, who had been making the concerted effort to get me into Nick Cave, I was like, he owns a bar in Berlin. We got to go. And like that became our obsession. Like we were just going to fly to Berlin. Obviously, everyone knows who Nick Cave is. And we could just ask the first person we saw at Tempelhof Airport and they'd point us to it and we'd go having the time of our lives. But things turned out quite differently.
And so remind me, what year was this when you were just about to set off on the trip to Berlin?
This was 1998.
All right. So we didn't have cell phones. I mean, we had cell phones back then. We didn't have smartphones. It's not like you could just take something out of your pocket and Google where is Nick Cave's bar. This is, you're not finding it that way. So
Google wasn't even around.
That's right. The people,
like I say this in the book.
Yeah.
Sorry. What?
I was going to say most of the people who work at Google now probably weren't around, but
yeah. I say this in the book, like, if we had asked Jeeves if Nick Cave owned a bar in Berlin and he said no, we would have assumed Jeeves was a liar.
So, so that's your MacGuffin, right? You're on this quest to find Nick Cave's bar. So you head out to Germany, and tell me what's the first thing you do when you get off the plane?
My mother, we had set the trip up through my family travel agent, which was, what you did at the time. But, you needed to travel and book the flights and everything. And we'd gotten this weird deal that if we were willing to have layovers in Luxembourg on either side of the trip, it would be like, I think we saved like $100 each, but like we had to leave from New Jersey. So like, being the young idiots we were, we drove from Boston to New Jersey, like 4.5 hours, like figuring in gas tolls and just time taken. We really didn't save any money whatsoever. And when we got to Berlin, my mother had offered to buy us a hotel room to like get us settled for that first night, which the travel agent assured us was right in the center of the city. And then as we watched like the city go by on the 45-minute cab ride out from the airport, we realized that it very much was not in the center of the city. When we asked at reception, when we were well out of Berlin proper, they told us, no, you're very far away. It cost us like $50 and we didn't have that much money to begin with. And we took this cab out And then we had to take a train back in the next day for 45 minutes to get to the city proper. So the whole thing was just a complete mess from the word go.
So maybe not as well thought out as you would have hoped, but what did you learn on this trip? I mean, did you? Well, first of all, I don't want to give away any spoilers in the book, but does Nick Cave own a bar in Berlin? I think is the big question on everybody's mind.
He does not.
At what point in your travels did you realize this?
I held on to this for like 18, 19 years. Okay. Like at no point did I question it during the trial. I just assumed that people weren't telling us for some reason. And like after we got back, I very much didn't want to know like definitively, like, because that would kind of ruin the mystique for me. But then like once I started writing the book, it became very apparent that he did not own a bar. Like when I eventually talked to some Germans about this, they laughed at the idea. Because I mean, they were all broke back then, you know. And like, I finally did find out though when I Googled, because I was doing this as a live show in 2019. I did a couple shows. And when I was Googling Nick Cave's bar to like see what like ads I had taken out were like appearing in places, I came across a writer in the UK's website, and she mentioned in her bio, Hattie Edmonds is her name. She mentioned hanging out at Nick Cave's bar in the 80s. And by that point I had, you know, given up hope that it ever existed. And I completely freaked out when I saw that line, and I messaged her. Apparently there was a bar called the Risiko in West Berlin from 1980, 81, closed in 1986. And the birthday party and Nick Cave and like a whole bunch of like that scene, like Blixa Bargeld from Einstürzende Neubauten bartended there. The filmmakers Jim Jarmusch and Wim Wenders would hang out there. It was very much a scene. And I think this is where the rumor that he owned a bar came from, like, because he was one of the bigger figures who hung out there, that, you know, reached me in 1998, 12 years after it had closed.
So what prompted you to start rethinking about, you know, this experience you had, over 20 years ago now? You know, what got you to put a stage show or sort of a performance piece about it together? And what prompted you to start writing the book?
It was always a story I wanted to tell. I loved telling it, you know, when I was at the pub with friends of mine. And it was a rather long story because it was just such an epic misadventure. And I'd been trying to convince my friend Andy, who I went with, that we should do it as a stage show. Like at various points in the 20 years after we went, I was like, no, it'll be fun. We'll get up on stage. I'll tell my side of the story. You'll tell your side. And obviously, like with things being so difficult midway through, like we really weren't getting along. And like if we were to tell the story on stage together afterward, we'd be calling each other out on stuff. I thought it would be a lot of fun. But Andy like had no interest in performing whatsoever. And like, you know, he was like, well, you know, you do it. I'm not going to do that. And finally, we actually went June 2nd, 1999. That was when we flew out of New Jersey. Like it took us a while to get it together and plan the trip and everything. So when I realized 2019 was 20 years later and the anniversary was coming up, I thought, you know, I should do it now. It makes sense to do it as a stage show now. And I wrote it up, started writing the book. And then the book kind of got really long, like telling all the details. Then I could sort of forge that into like the highlights for the stage show, the funniest stuff. And then when I did it, it was fantastic and I wanted to keep doing it. And that was the plan. And then COVID hit.
Silly COVID. Now, what was happening, you know, it was 20 years ago between you and Andy? Was it just too much time together in close quarters? Or it sounds like you had somewhat of a, I won't call it a falling out, but it seems like there was some kind of tension along that trip. What was the root of that?
Yeah, I think it could probably be summed up in that for a 9-day trip, I brought 4 novels with me and like really want to get some reading done. Like for some reason I couldn't do that at home. And Andy like had never been out of the country before. And like, you know, he wanted to experience that. Whereas I had like, there are times where I just like wanted to like, you know, be in my own head with a couple books. And so like, I think that was the issue. And the fact that he ran out of money 3 days into it. And then it was kind of up to me to fund the rest of the trip, especially in that we then went to Prague to follow these girls that we had met who he was completely in love with. And it was up to me to like pay for all this. It was just all these little things and, you know, being together 24 hours a day. And someone pointed out to me last year that like this totally would have been the undoing of lesser friendships.
Right.
Like, so like this was really like a sort of the fact that we made it through and we're still speaking and we're, you know, the best of friends for years afterward really is a testament to,
I imagine there's probably a few ways to make some quick money in Berlin at the time, but probably not very safe.
No, nothing I would have been into.
No, I'm sure. Why not just speaking of like musical? I mean, Berlin really is a musical city. I remember, you know, David Bowie and Iggy Pop had I think a heck of a time in Berlin back in the day.
And like you think, like even as we were realizing we weren't going to find Nick Cave's bar, there were like other sites like that we could have gone to see. Like Nick Cave recorded there, like this Hansa Studios, which I think is where Bowie was as well. And that would have been awesome to see. But like at no point did it occur to us to like go and check that out. Maybe, you know, give up this pursuit of, you know, the sole focus of the bar. To be fair, on our second night, we got hold of a bottle of absinthe. And the idea was the woman who told me that he owned a bar, she was working at the hostel in Barcelona. That was where I met her when I was traveling that first time. And she had been working at a hostel in Berlin, and it was called Circus. So we went there the second night. And instead of going out and seeing the sites, we thought, all right, we know a former employee. We can drop their name and we'll get some free beers. So we sat in the hostel bar for like 6-7 hours. We had 10 beers and 2 shots of Jaeger each.
Oh my gosh.
Which, you know, should be enough for anybody. At the end, as they're closing up, this pretty blonde Scottish girl walks in, and the only thing she says is choo choo, choo choo. And we're like, hey, why are you acting like a train? To which she replied, choo choo. And, you know, they're trucking us all out. So we follow her. We're all going back in the same place into the hostel proper. And finally she stops saying choo choo and, you know, introduces herself. And like, we start hanging out. She's traveling with a friend who Andy fell in love with. More beers come out. Somebody's just come back from Prague, excuses themselves, comes back into the lobby with a bottle of absinthe. And like, we'd always heard about absinthe, you know, you couldn't get it in the States at the time. You could really only get it in like Portugal and the Czech Republic. And we'd heard all the stories that it sent the poets crazy. And, you know, at this point in our inebriation, it's like, you know, 2-3 in the morning. There's a whole ritual you do with absinthe, like, you know, with the sugar and the spoons. And the guy who had the bottles, you know, pouring out rounds for everybody. And we do like 2 or 3 rounds with everybody. But in between this, we're grabbing the absinthe bottle and just swigging from it freely. Like, I think in addition to the 10 beers and 2 shots of Jaeger, we each had around 6 shots of absinthe. And I woke up at 9:30 the next night. And walking down the street to Burger King was the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life.
Because of the hangover, and I went back, or something else?
Yeah. The hangover was insane. We mildly hallucinated for 2.5 days. Like nothing felt right about my body or brain for a good 48 hours or so. So this kicked off the trip. This was like, you know, the second night in Berlin proper, and sort of set the tone for the rest of it. Like we really weren't in our right minds. Like we were dealing with some serious, like, you know, terrible hangovers.
That'd be enough to turn me off of drinking for a while. I mean, first of all, I'm a lightweight as it is, but just hearing 10 beer shots absinthe. I did absinthe once. I was in the UK. This has got to be 20 years ago, on a business trip, and I had a friend from New York who was living out there, and we had dinner, and she's like, "Oh, I've got absinthe." I'm like, "What is that?" She's like, "Oh, let me show you." So she prepared it, and it was this. Hallucinating is not is absolutely true. I think. I mean, it was, and I was not swigging it out of the bottle. You know, but man, it was a strange experience. It was a strange experience,
and it wasn't pleasant at all.
Have you touched it since?
What's that?
Have you touched it since?
No, I don't think so. I wouldn't want to. It was very much that's it for me.
Yep. Yep. Well, so, a lot of the people who listen to this are aspiring authors themselves. So can you talk a little bit about your process for writing the novelization? I shouldn't say novelization. It's a piece of nonfiction, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes.
All right. Yeah. So can you just talk about your writing process for it, for this memoir?
Yeah, I just basically sat down and luckily I had been telling the story, to people over the years. So I kind of got that out, like the way I would tell it down on paper. And then there were all these, like, Andy kept a diary, it was like 2 pages. There wasn't much in it, but I kept pestering him, can you find this? I'm going to do this. I want to do it right. It would be really funny to revisit that. And finally he found it, texted me like all the photos of it and some other like weird stuff he had found. And so that sparked memories. And it was really just a question of sitting down every day and doing it until it was finished. Or at least I thought it was finished. When I went back on the first draft, man, it was weird, thinking that there was really a lot of work left to be done. But I didn't really have plans to publish it because I'd started doing the shows and I was focusing on the live work. But as I was getting that together, it became the first draft. And then I sort of let that sit for maybe, 6-8 months. And when the pandemic picked up, I was like, oh, this would be a great thing to revisit now that there's time. I'm in my apartment 24/7.
Right.
This will be a good thing to do, and I could Kickstarter it, and it would be great. And then I went back and I went over and over it. Probably a good 7 or 8 drafts, and then I paid someone to because I was doing it myself. I didn't really want it edited. It was the story the way I wanted it to be told, but I wanted to have make sure there were no grammar or spelling mistakes or tense mistakes, because I had written it mostly in the past tense, but I like present tense a lot, and
sure,
I think it adds to the story. So halfway through the book, when we get on the plane, it switches to present tense from past, because before it was all just sort of giving backstory as to our love of Nick Cave, what was going on in our lives, and then tenses, that took forever to get right. But I'm glad I did. When I sit down and read it now, I think it flows in the way I want it to.
So, because I know you've also written fiction. Off License to Kill, I know was your first novel. In your mind, what are the big differences between writing a memoir and writing a novel?
It was kind of, at the beginning of the memoir, I mentioned 2 women who were huge influences on my life at the time. And what struck me is when I went back and read the first draft after 6 months, I did not name them. And I was like, if I'm going to do this, and I've heard people talk about this, with regards to writing songs as well, is if you're going to do it right, you really have to embarrass yourself. So I had to be completely honest with how I felt back then, and what, a screw up I was in many, many ways. And just sort of face that and get it on the page and, cringe through it. Whereas with fiction, it can be whatever you want it to be. And not to say that, Off License to Kill is a comedic novel. It's meant to be pure comedy. And funnily enough, lots of scenes were lifted from the Berlin trip, especially at the beginning. Off License to Kill is about the British drunken Secret Service. And, some of my crazy adventures from when I was that age, just went, verbatim into the book with the names changed.
Right. So yeah, I was curious as to what that diary could contain that you mentioned, your traveling compadre. And I was thinking, is page 1 just him, being pissed that you're reading 4 books, and is page 2 just all about a hangover?
There were no barbs against me, which was nice. Always, forgiven fairly soon after. But page 1 was the parking lot of Newark Airport, just how difficult the trip was then. And we hadn't even left. We haven't even gotten onto the plane yet. How difficult it was to find parking and just that things didn't make any sense. Page 2 was really just about how difficult finding our way around Berlin was because we hadn't done any preparation. And also there was Fanta is a huge soft drink in Europe, especially Germany. And Andy was quite, taken with that because, we don't drink much Fanta here in the States, but over there it was everywhere. And he wrote, quite a bit about that.
Well, what are your lessons learned, lessons that young kids, 20 somethings embarking on adventures in traveling? What are some lessons you would impart on them as a direct result of your experience?
Well, I'd like to say, prepare, make the minimum. Like we hadn't booked anywhere to stay except for the hotel room my mother bought. Like we just rolled up to that Circus hostel on a Friday in the summer in a major European capital. And we lucked out that like they had a room available for 2 nights. Like otherwise, I don't know what we would have done. It would have been very miserable, but I don't know. I don't know if I would actually I'm kind of like that anyway, in that I kind of fly by the seat of my pants and things tend to work out. And I think there's a certain magic in that. And like looking back on it now, like the whole thing was just such a miserable experience to live through. But like looking back on it now, it's hilarious. And like if we had planned it out more, it wouldn't have been as great of a story.
Now, the other thing I got to know is, did he get the girl? Did Andy get the girl that he was in love with?
Oh, gosh. This is the saddest story. So I'll give you the full thing because I like the way this flows. When I went back to bed after being awake for an hour and a half after the absinthe, thinking this is all too much for me, Andy decided to drink through it. And the 2 Scottish girls found him like cowering in an alleyway across the street from the hostel. And they like took him in and like realized he just needed another beer, and like they would sit with him and comfort him. And this turned into, they were getting rowdy. They're all drinking again in the hostel lobby, and the guy behind the desk cut them off. So they pooled all their money. And Andy just when another guy went out into the streets of Berlin, found a doner kebab vendor, like a hot dog cart, and just slammed all the Deutschmarks onto the counter and said, "Beer, as much as this will buy." And that turned out to be 35 large cans.
Holy shit. But is that why he ran out of money 3 days into the trip?
Yes. So he and this other guy bring him back, and like the hostel management are not happy, but everyone's having a good time. Andy comes upstairs around 3:30 in the morning to get me to join in. Right. And like he like shaking me awake, and I'm not having it. Like my body does not feel right. I'd like, if I'm going to get up and go anywhere, it's to a hospital. And like, he's like shaking me. He's got this huge smile on his face. Like I can tell he just has a story that he's dying to tell me. And it was the 35 cans. But then like, at this point, I'm standing up in the hostel doorway, and he like lays this on me. He goes, "Aug, I'm in love with Hannah. I've never met a woman who can drink with me all night like this before." And like, I'm a sucker for love. And at that point, I just grabbed my shoes, went down to the lobby, and someone handed me a beer, and we just stayed up all night drinking. And like, the girls invited us to meet them in Prague the next day. And like, it was so nice. Part of what we each found, they gave us handwritten notes and like the brochure to the Clown and Bard hostel where they were staying. And it was so nice and sweet. And like, they hugged us goodbye. We'll see you tomorrow. They go to bed, and it's at that point I realized that Andy has run out of money, that I have to pay for this. So I tell them that, all right, we'll go, but we're going to take the bus. It'll be much cheaper than the train. Everyone at that point goes, "Ooh, you really don't want to do that. Have you ever been on a road in the Czech Republic?" I'm like, I'm adamant about this because, we don't have much money left. I have to make sure we have another, 7 days ahead of us so that we can eat, drink, sleep, and get home to Boston from New Jersey, from Berlin.
Right.
So we go to the train station the bus station when we get up that Sunday, only to be greeted with a sign that buses don't run from Berlin on Sundays. So, and probably the most depressing day of my life, we just bought some strawberry beer and watched some kids playing basketball in a Berlin park until we could go to another hostel, get up the next day and get a train. At that point, I was like, all right, I'll put it on my credit card. So we get up and like Scotland is playing the Czech Republic in a football match that day. And there are like thousands of Scottish fans on the train, just chanting, screaming, just living it up from like 8 a.m. And like, we, at that point, we had nothing else to do. We were joined in. It was super fun. And, we're drinking for 5 hours on the way to Prague. We get to the hostel and I go in and talk to the guy at the front desk, and there's no room at the inn. But they're going to find us. They have a sister hostel down the street. They're going to make some calls and get us rooms. And past the reception, there's a hostel bar. And I see Erin, the blonde, the choo-choo girl, drinking at the bar. And I say to Andy, they're here. We can't get rooms. They're fully booked up. They're going to sort us out with a place down the street, but let's go tell the girls that we're here and we'll make a plan to, meet up with them like in half an hour or whatever, once we check into our room. And Andy just hangs his head and goes, I can't face her like this. I'm disgusting. I've been drinking all day. I haven't showered, Let's go shower, freshen up. We'll be back in half an hour. And like, it's one of those moments you always think back to that I could have done something different. I could have done the sensible thing and on my own just went and told Erin, we'll be back. But I just said, all right. Andy and I went down the street, showered. We were back in like half hour, 40 minutes tops. And we never saw them again.
No way to get in touch with them or anything like that.
Nope. I have no cell phones, nothing. They too, I don't think there was no record of them at reception. Like they had to get rooms elsewhere. And like, yeah, it was so depressing.
Now in this age of social media, have you tried? Because I got to know, did you try hunting them down? Did you hire a private investigator? Like what? I mean, is this where that story ends?
No, unfortunately, we only had first names. And they were, I think they were from, it's either Aberdeen or Dundee. Like at this point, I don't remember exactly where they're from. And that's too little to go on.
So how did Andy take it?
He was pretty bummed, but though we reasoned that, if they were at the hostel bar once, they might come back again. So true to our form, when the first night in a major European city, we just sat there all night drinking, thinking they might come back. And then it was at this point that we really started getting testy with each other.
Right. Well, I don't know if you know this, but it's rumored that Simon Le Bon from Duran Duran has a bar in Prague. So,
do you want to go?
maybe we should go.
Let's do it.
Should hook that up. I actually have some money now, so we could take the train. We don't have to take the bus. Not that you took the bus, but
go in style.
So where can people buy Nick Cave's Bar, Aug? Where would you recommend they go to buy this?
I'm a big fan of Bookshop these days, the sort of independent Amazon-esque site, but that really supports local independent bookstores. It's available everywhere at all the online outlets, and it's in some book and record stores too, which is I'm psyched about. The Brookline Booksmith in Boston, which is a shop I love from my days and living in Boston. Grimey's Records in Nashville, one of the great record stores. It's at a couple shops in Berlin, which is cool. I have a list on my website of everywhere where it's available.
Oh, yeah. Why don't you throw out the URL for that website?
That would be augstone.com, AUGSTONE.
Now, I have to ask, on augstone.com, does Young Southpaw make an appearance?
There are links to some Southpaw stuff, but Young Southpaw has his own site.
Young South.
I acknowledge, that I am young Southpaw, but young Southpaw doesn't acknowledge that he's me.
Well, maybe that's the absinthe talking. I'm not sure. So, any events coming up? Anything else that you could plug? I mean, as we're coming out of COVID now, what are the plans? Any plans to hit some stages anytime soon?
I'd like to. I think it's a bit too early for me to feel comfortable hitting a stage. Later this year, I'd definitely like to. I have been keeping up the Young Southpaw stories. Young Southpaw, part of an hour podcast, which is at youngsouthpaw.com and, all the podcast places. But I'm going to record my 60th story this week. So there's, many hours of absurdity up there. I'm doing a podcast these days. Actually, I'm doing two, that one, and et cetera, with Aug Stone, where I've been talking to lots of my favorite musicians, writers, artists. So I've been doing that weekly as well. So there's a lot of stuff to check out.
A lot of stuff to check out in the world of Aug Stone.
Yeah.
And sometimes Young Southpaw. Well, very good, Aug. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. This has been fun.
Excellent. Yeah, it has. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, there it is. My conversation with Aug Stone, Renaissance man, this Aug Stone. So please check out his memoir, Nick Cave's Bar, on bookshop.org and learn more about Aug. Visit augstone.com. I wonder if his fans are called stoners. I think he should brand that. I don't know. Maybe that's not what he's going for, but I think it could work. So that's augstone.com. Now listen. You might be thinking to yourself, Mike or self, it'd be weird. Unless your name is Mike, then I guess that works. But you might be thinking to yourself, where can I check out past episodes of Uncorking a Story? Well, I've got good news for you. You can check out past episodes of Uncorking a Story wherever you find your podcast. Or you can shortcut it and go right to MikeCarlin.com because they are all there. And when you're on MikeCarlin.com, of course, please sign up for our mailing list so you can be kept in the loop with everything involving the world of Mike Carlin, including the Uncorking Story podcast, plus my novels. So yeah, check those out too. I've got 8 novels out. The Ruin of Souls is the most recent one. It is out now. I know you're going to love it. If you like good storytelling. Gee, there I am tooting my own horn, huh? Like someone's got to do it. Sometimes you got to toot your own horn, you know what I'm saying? Hey, look, I've been married for like 22 years. I toot my own horn all the time. But check out The Ruin of Souls. And you know what? Buy it. Buy all the others too, because you know what? I've got 3 kids to put through college, and I am not shameful in asking. So, for all the hardworking people here at Uncorking a Story, this is Mike Carlin saying, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.